I want to welcome everyone on behalf of the Louis Finkelstein Institute for Religious and Social Studies. I am delighted. I feel like Siobhan in the back is our C-SPAN because we are thrilled that this will be on tape and that virtually all the organizations that are represented here will have the opportunity to show their audiences as well, far and wide, this important discussion tonight. As you came in, you should have gotten an index card and a golf pencil. This is not for your golf score, but it is if you want the opportunity for questions and answers. One of the ushers will collect them after some of the conversation goes on, and we will be able to sort through them and make the questions hopefully flow in some sensible order. Turn it off. There. See, I've done it, and you can too, please. If it will make you feel better, turn it on vibrate. But please, we don't want interruption with phone conversation. I'm going to call on our colleague, Rabbi Josh Ratner, who is the rabbi of Kol Ami in Cheshire, Connecticut, and one of the two moving forces in the Earth Day events that we've had here, both at lunchtime and this evening. The other is Rabbi Nina Carden, who Josh will introduce in turn. But I am really very happy that you're here, very happy that our students participated this afternoon. And over dinner, we had the beginning of what I found to be a morally uplifting discussion. And I'm looking forward to that to continue with your participation as well. Rabbi Ratner.
Good evening. I have the privilege of introducing our three esteemed panelists as well as our moderator. Eric Asadurian is a senior fellow at World Watch Institute, where he has studied cultural change, consumerism, economic degrowth, ecological ethics, corporate responsibility, and sustainable communities over the past 11 plus years.
And he's really 75 years old.
You can see that we don't go that long on a topic before we move on.
This is a short introduction, by the way. Eric has directed 2 editions of Vital Signs and 4 editions of State of the World, including the hot off the presses State of the World 2013, Is Sustainability Still Possible? Eric also directs the Transforming Cultures Project. Laura Berry is Executive Director of the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility. The organization emphasizes community, social justice, and responsible investing. After working for 5 years as a chemical engineer, Laura began a 17-year career as a large-cap value portfolio manager on Wall Street. She'll be giving tips after the show, after our presentation. In 2001, Laura began her nonprofit career as the director of the New London Development Corporation's Community Development Initiative. She joined ICCR in 2007. Alexa Bradley is a program director at On the Commons, where she works to support community solutions rooted in the Commons principles of collective stewardship and equitable use of our resources. Her current work includes a focus on the Great Lakes Commons Initiative. Alexa has worked as an organizer, facilitator, trainer, and popular educator for over 25 years, with a particular focus on linking community organizing to broader social movement strategies. And our moderator this evening is Rabbi Nina Beth Carden. She's the founder and director of the Baltimore Jewish Environmental Network, an organization dedicated to greening her local Jewish community. She is also the founder and director of the Baltimore Orchard Project, an organization that grows, gleans, and gives away urban fruit, and a co-founder and chair of the Interfaith Partners for the Chesapeake, an interfaith organization that works on behalf of the Chesapeake Bay watershed. With that, I'll yield the floor to Nina.
Thank you for being here. I want to thank the Finkelstein Institute and my esteemed colleague, Rabbi Vizovsky, for helping to host this and pull it all together. And yes, we have the audience present before us, and we have an international audience on the camera, so that we're really hopefully a robust and ever-growing organization, people, movement, who will be able to begin to address these critical issues. Tonight, I want to just set the stage for us. We gather tonight on a quest, which, if we get it right, promises to resolve some of the most implacable and insistent issues today. That is, the pursuit of social justice, the health of the planet, economic vitality, and individual well-being. And that's all rolled up in one issue, and we're all going to solve that in an hour and a half. So the quest really stated is this: given that we live in a finite world, how are we to equitably and sustainably share and manage the natural resources of the earth, and by extension, the blessings of civilization? Expanded a bit more, the question goes on: what can be considered just in the ownership, allocation, and use of the world's resources, from which all our wealth comes, and on which our economy and humanity's well-being depends? Even more, how do we build a marketplace that honors this vision? We're compelled to ask and answer this question now because, as all of you sitting here know, for the first time in history, humans have become what E.O. Wilson calls a geophysical force, a species able by our appetites and our behavior to affect not just a riverbank, or a city, or a floodplain, or even a forest, as in the days of old, but the very workings of our planet. And though we tend to forget, the workings of our planet do form the very foundations of the well-being of our civilization. Somehow we think we just live on the earth, as opposed to live from the earth. So it is the manner and lust with which we pursue, distribute, and consume the earth's resources that gives rise to three of today's greatest wrongs, which we will address tonight: environmental devastation, an ever-receding sense of ease and happiness, and unconscionable and insupportable social inequality. We need to return to the essential questions of what do we really need to live a good life, and how do we properly fill these needs? These questions are partially issues of biology and technology, but even more, they are issues of the spirit and the marketplace, which is why we gather here at a seminary in Manhattan, the intersection of a center for the exploration and celebration of the human spirit, located on an island that is the center and celebration of the practice of a global marketplace. So that's what our task is tonight. The game plan for this evening is, y'all set? Each panelist will have 12 minutes to solve the world's problems, to make introductory remarks, and then we will encourage cross-panel conversation, and then we will open the floor to your questions, which I hope that you scribble, and those cards will be collected, and then we'll hopefully close with and leave with a hopeful sense that while the challenges are extraordinary, they are there for us, and we are going to be up to the task. So with that, I turn the floor over to Laura Berry.
Laura, if you sit, you can use the mic more effectively.
Oh. Allow me to do that then. Can everyone hear me? Wonderful. Well, I really want to begin my remarks today by saying thank you. Thank you both to Rabbi Bert and to Rabbi Nina for inviting us to be together today. The funny thing about the organization that I represent, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, is that we're neighbors. We're just up the street at 120th and Claremont, and we are so delighted to be in an environment where leaders of faith are being taught, are doing scholarship, and are growing their ability to influence and shape the world that our children and our grandchildren and future generations will live in. And so, you know, one of the things that as people of faith, we really revel in the privilege of being invited to share our work with others. In interfaith work, which is what ICCR is all about, we're actually called upon to bring our deepest convictions together. We're joined by a common desire to really express our faith through the kinds of actions that we do. And today, when we were sitting upstairs having dinner, we were all kind of ruminating on, what did we hope folks would leave the room with today? And I think that there was a common theme that really talked about how do we translate what we feel in our hearts as kind of an erosion of a commitment to future generations? How do we translate that to the kinds of actions that, frankly, our faith has called us to attend to for thousands and thousands of years? And so when we think about faith and action, I often think about Rabbi Heschel, who really said it best when he defined mitzvah as prayer in the form of a deed. Everybody on these panels, we're action people, and we hope you will be too when you leave us today. At the Interfaith Center, we actually often use as our tagline that we're inspired by faith and committed to action. And so I really suspect that although our roots were with 12 Protestant denominational leaders who were really wrestling with some of the questions of justice, action, and wealth, and how do you live in a world as stewards and try to ensure more just and more sustainable practices, I have often felt that our tagline was in fact inspired by this idea of mitzvah and by Rabbi Heschel's wonderful teachings. So I asked myself, what is this Catholic kid doing here today to share ICCR's work and some of my own musings about this and about how our faith traditions are all really powerfully connected to the idea of money? So I'd like to kind of give you a little bit of a flavor of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, what we do, and to share with you this notion of faith in action and how it might challenge you or inspire you to think a little bit about what does it mean to be a steward of wealth in today's society when we are all so very, very concerned about sustainability and about the kind of planet we're leaving behind for future generations. So who or what is this crazy place, the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility? Let me give you some quick background. First, we are really the pioneer coalition of active investors who have this kind of crazy notion that as owners of corporations, we actually have the right to influence their behavior so that they might, in fact, contribute to a more just and sustainable planet. We've been engaging corporations as shareholders, as stewards of wealth, for over 42 years, and we've had some pretty interesting results over that time. We really think that we have had, through these engagements, some really identifiable wins along the way. We are about 300 members, and those members represent a wide variety of faiths. We've really looked to our stewardship to challenge our work and to challenge companies to really change the way they behave and the way they practice. The 300 members represent somewhere north of $100 billion in invested capital. We typically engage in something like 300 or 400 engagements with corporations and companies over time. And we really believe that it is our fiduciary responsibility to not only talk to the companies we own as shareholders about these issues of justice and sustainability, but we also understand very clearly that our fiduciary responsibility is to bring good returns, because the members that are represented at ICCR are pension plans, our college endowments, our hospital systems, our congregations, who really need to create investment returns over time to actually support their work. So whether it's subsidizing the efforts of something like JTS, whether it's subsidizing the work in a hospital system, whether it is providing retirement for hardworking rabbis at the end of their careers. We need to get good returns. So I think the first takeaway that I'd love for you to have from ICCR's work in the world is that because we are activists who use words like justice and sustainability, it does not mean we are necessarily thinking all corporations are bad. It is not that we don't need to get good returns. However, we do believe that just and sustainable practices over the long term are actually very good business. So with this focus on good returns, one of the reasons that we have credibility with corporations as shareholders, one of the reasons that when we bring issues to the table, they don't just run and hide, is that they actually know that because of the kinds of organizations that ICCR represents, we're actually long-term investors. And in fact, because we represent investors from faith communities, some would argue that we are actually the longest-term investors out there, that in fact our time horizon isn't 5 years, isn't 10 years, but it's rather eternity. And so when you have that kind of perspective, folks like, I'll just name a few of our favorites, ExxonMobil, General Motors, Pfizer, they know we're not going away. We will come back year in and year out with our questions, with our concerns. We will be by their side, encouraging them to be more just and more sustainable in their practices. So, how does this all work? How does this notion of justice and sustainability as being good business actually work? Well, when you are a shareholder in a corporation, you actually have the right to bring your concerns to the company's annual meeting. Over the years, going back to 1971, during the apartheid struggles in South Africa, ICCR's founders went to a company which at the time was the largest market capital company in the world, General Motors, who had a very large operation in South Africa. And at that point in time, a group of faith-based investors went to GM and said, you know, GM, we would really like you to pay attention to how you're working and what's going on in South Africa. And at that point, basically a very large movement happened. And the movement is not what you may think. The movement that happened was that in filing a shareholder proposal asking GM to look at the impact of their operations in South Africa, by raising that question, people began to realize that as shareholders, we could bring these issues to the attention of corporations, and it wouldn't just be rallying workers, which is of course very important. It wouldn't just be creating consumer demand. But what we realized was that by filing a shareholder proposal, you could actually talk directly to the board of directors. And so that was the first occasion since that time, particularly beginning in the 80s, ICCR members have filed over 2,500 corporate actions on issues of the environment since the mid-80s. And what has changed in that time is there's been a continuum of progress. Again, go back to this patience and this idea of eternity. When we started, we just went to companies and said, tell us, what are your emissions like? Tell us what you're doing about pollution. Tell us what you're doing about leaving toxic things behind in poor communities. And companies would say, oh, really, we don't really need to tell you. But we would come back year after year. So then they started to report. Once they started to report, then we started to ask them questions like, all right, well, so now you're telling us, well, what are you doing about it? Could you set some goals and some targets to reduce the emissions that you're putting out there? That was the next step along the continuum. And then a global movement started where actually companies are now expected to put out corporate social responsibility reports, environmental reports. Legislation has risen up to help support some of these issues. And so let's fast forward to 2013 and the environmental movement today. Nowadays, rather than saying to a company, please tell us what you're doing, please tell us about your hydrocarbon emissions, please be better citizens, now we're actually looking systemically. Now we are going to banks and asking banks to look at material risks and impacts that might occur if, as underwriters, they underwrite a new nuclear power plant or a new coal plant. We are now going to companies and saying what might be the long-term public health consequences and therefore business risk of some of the toxics you're leaving behind in vulnerable communities. What happens if you're mining in a developing nation and, oh well, those folks won't be causing any trouble? And then they do. There's a business risk that goes beyond the moral risk. And I think one of the things that we've learned as investors and one of the powerful system-changing techniques is that actually, when it comes to justice and sustainability, we don't care if you agree with why we're doing what we're doing. What we care about is that you stop doing things that are unjust or unsustainable. And so looking at financing, looking at whether a company gets community input before they put new extractive operations in a community, or before they build a new power plant or a new waste disposal site in a vulnerable community. Looking at some of these issues have become very, very important. And so I think one of the things that I'd like to leave you with today is this idea of long-term, that many, many, many of these issues have taken a very long time to develop. The systems to break down have been really the result of industrialization and of thinking about how do we adapt as the world adapts? How do we adapt now that there's almost 7 billion of us on the planet, instead of at the time when capitalism was first coming to fruition 400 years ago? How do we start to create and invent new systems that will help us be more resilient? And I think the approach that ICCR takes through using the power of shareholder voice, through bringing the inspiration of faith communities, has been a small part of staying at the table, of raising the issues, of raising the voices. So that I really appreciate your attention to these opening remarks. I hope that you'll think about all the different ways that your investments might connect to some of this work, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have a little later. Thank you.
Thank you.
Is that good? All right. Well, happy Earth Day. I actually think it's kind of wonderful that we're here celebrating Earth Day, since it's sort of become a bit of a forgotten holiday. And I actually remember the first one. It kind of dates me a bit. And I think I just recently learned the history of Earth Day. Apparently, it was an idea of a U.S. senator, and convinced Kennedy, actually President Kennedy at the time, to go around and promoting it. And it got a very tepid response. I don't think he was all that on fire about it, perhaps, but nor were the crowds. I think he was sort of trying to convince people to get on board. But what did happen is it began to pick up some interest and steam on college campuses. And then, like wildfire, it spread, and young people became very excited about the idea of an ecological movement. And it wasn't that long after Rachel Carson's book, A Silent Spring, had come out, and there was a burgeoning, just baby ecological movement at the time, environmental movement. And college students really led the way, and other people got on board. And I think it's a really important story to remember, because it holds two ideas in it that I think are important for tonight. One is the power of a transformational idea that is ripe and can take hold. And the other is that almost always it is led from people like you and young people, average citizens, rather than from those that we put in levels of high leadership, that is not always the place, or often not the place where the biggest change comes. And so I think it's just fortuitous that we're here tonight and thinking about bold questions, big questions, and bold answers. I doubt we'll answer all of them, but I'm hoping that there's some seeds and sparks that come from tonight's conversation that have that kind of potential. I want to start with a little story, and I'm going to talk about something that's both very ancient and I think quite groundbreaking, which is the Commons. But I'll come back to that. So the story is I was working with a group in a neighborhood to set a tool bank where we could all have, we could all say, well, I've got a power this, and I've got a sander and drill and whatever, and we could sort of have a way of sharing those. And we were actually doing this as a congregation, looking at it together. And there was a man in the congregation who originally was from Haiti, and he began sort of chuckling and laughing to himself. And at some point we said, well, what's so funny about that? And he said, where I come from, if I've got a ladder, my neighbor's got a ladder. We don't need a tool bank. And he thought it was just very funny that we Americans needed a tool bank. And it was a really poignant moment in a lot of ways, because we realized we really did need a tool bank. We had sort of lost that inherent sense of neighborliness that would extend a sense of ours and belonging past maybe our closest family and friends. And the idea that just any neighbor would sort of be able to share in that was very foreign to us. And so it feels like a story that illuminates a bit where we are right now as a people, that we long for and need new solutions, collaborative, shared solutions, and yet we sort of lost the hang of it a bit. We've lost the ideas. We don't really have the ease of sharing, the ease of knowing where the boundaries are and aren't with what's mine, what's yours. So I like the title of tonight's program, and I'm looking around to see if I can see it because I didn't write it down, but it had the word ours in it. What's mine, what's
Yours, mine, and ours.
Yes, thank you. Yours, mine, ours. And I think the word ours is a word that is kind of elusive today. And what do we really mean by that? So that's what we're going to have. That's really the center of tonight's conversation, is this question of ours. What is it? What does belong to us together? Who is part of that ours? And how do we behave when we believe something is ours? What do we do when we believe that? And not just mine or yours. We're much clearer about that. And I'm going to talk about something called the Commons. And I want to ask, how many of you have actually heard that term or has some resonance for you? Wow, okay, so a fairly good number of you. So I'm hoping it's a word that's familiar enough to evoke some sense of the wisdom and power of that as an available way of sharing things, but also is unfamiliar enough that it might invite some new sense of possibility or thinking. And that's really how I think it's positioned right now at our time. It's something that almost every culture and tradition around the globe has some tradition of communal resource sharing, whether they called it commons or not. And there's vestiges of it today. We'll talk more about that. But it's also something that, again, we have lost a bit of the sense of. And so it's emergent, and it invites us to think about how we share resources and how we take care of them together in some really fresh and hopeful ways. And I'm going to suggest that it's really important, if we want to take the idea of a sustainable planet seriously, that we really do need to rethink what is ours at every level, from the most sort of local, immediate to the globe. I think this is a crowd I don't really need to say a lot about, the fact that we're living at a time of a lot of breakdown. The ecological realities that we hear about are very alarming and worrying, and we just have to look at that starkly and say, well, we really have to do something different. Carrying on as we are is not an option, and yet that can be a very overwhelming proposition. And economically, we can see, the strains of the last, 4 or 5 years now have really showed us the vulnerabilities of the economic systems and structures that we've trusted, and the need, again, to sort of look at some of the foundations of that and see if some of the working assumptions actually hold. And so in looking at all that, I think we need to look again, at how we understand ourselves in relationship to each other, how we understand ourselves in terms of these larger questions. So why the commons? First, I want to give a definition. Many of you indicated that you're familiar with it. There's probably lots of ways to define it. One way, which I think is relevant for this evening, is the commons is an essential form of shared wealth that we either inherit or create together, which we must take care of, share in a sustainable and equitable way, and pass on to future generations undiminished. So that's one way to think about it. And again, it's both ancient and emergent. The word first shows up as the commons in Roman law as a form of property that belongs to the community. It's neither the individuals nor the kings or the emperors, but something that belongs to everyone. And then it sort of shows up again later in various points in European history, most notably in the Magna Carta, for those of you that are history students, as a codified way for peasants to assert their claim on gleaning, harvesting, fishing, grazing on common land that they clearly did not own, but that they were permitted those uses. And there were quite a few fights. There's the Forest Charter. Later, there's a whole issue around fishing and access to the ocean. And my guess is peasants everywhere, probably all of us come way back from peasants somewhere, had to fight for just these very basic sort of like subsistence level rights. And that the commons were really important, our sort of livelihood and even survival was very connected to the commons. If you didn't have a place to graze your sheep or glean or fish, then you were not going to survive. And so this really deep connection to the sort of well-being of the commons and our own well-being was very much established. And again, many cultures had other words. The commons is what comes down to us, but again, as I sort of have gotten more interested in this and talking to other communities, people have different words for this. Even today around the world, people have different ways of talking about that which we share, has different language. And I'm curious at the end of tonight if any of you know of words from other cultures or traditions. I'm trying to collect those. But we also have vestiges of the commons with us now. It's not just something ancient. I think that's really important to remember because it can feel romantic or maybe even utopian. If you think of a library, there was a wonderful little op-ed on public radio at one point saying, imagine someone today coming before Congress and proposing funding for libraries. Great, let's build a building in every tiny community and we'll fill it with a bunch of free books and computers and DVDs, and everybody can come in and take them home, and then they'll just bring them back and it will all be free. And you'd get laughed out of the place, but this was an idea that seemed really available at some time in our history. It's a really good idea, really a good investment in the education, well-being, and enjoyment of our communities, and we did that. And it was a partnership between small communities and business leaders and the government to make that possible. And so we've inherited these incredible libraries today. And I live in Brooklyn, and I love every time I go into that library, the Central Library, I feel like I'm going into, a sacred space. It looks like a sacred space. It's a beautiful thing. And I think that, that's the Commons has something about it of the sacred, of meaning that is beyond the price or the exchange value. Central Park is obviously not just worth what the land is worth, although that land's probably worth a lot, but we wouldn't cash it out. And we think about our parks, our waters, the value of our clean drinking water is much greater than what we might be able to sell that for in a bunch of Dasani bottles. The internet is a commons, Wikipedia, public spaces of all kinds, cultural knowledge, things that get passed on and enhanced over the years, great artworks and music and so on. These are all commons that we often take for granted. And one of the reasons I think it's important to name them as commons is so we recognize them for what they are, that it becomes a more available idea to us culturally to think, oh, that's a commons. That's something I want to really be aware of, protect, take care of. What other things might be created and enhanced that are the commons? I think it's also worth noting that the commons are really the foundation, and you talked about this a little bit, Laura, are the foundation of a lot of the forms of wealth that we also draw on from individually and as in other forms societally. So you think of someone like Bill Gates, who built Microsoft as many times over a billionaire, I think, and that would not have been possible had he not drawn on the commons. So the internet was something that was publicly created, the architecture and infrastructure for that. He went to a public university, presumably, could build with the assumption that an electrical grid would be up, and publicly funded, and so on. And so there's a lot of the ways that we assume the commons and derive benefit from it. I think it's also important to say about the commons, just by way of definition, that it's not just stuff. It's really what our relationship to it is. And I think that's what's really important as we think about this as something forward-looking, is how do we, and this gets the idea of ours, how do we have a relationship to something as an ours? Who else do we need to share it with? How do we share it with them? Sort of inherent in a commons is an us. And in some cases, that's a very small localized us. So perhaps there is, some of you participate in a community garden, or there's a local park you take care of in some way. Wikipedia is a little more diffuse, but if you're a contributor to that, you also know that other people are going to be looking and editing, and you're part of something together. And there's a set of mutual accountabilities that are involved in that I could take a library book out and trash it, but mostly people don't. Mostly people do not do that. Most people borrow it and they bring it back and they observe that social norm, that sense of reciprocity, because I know I'm going to want to borrow a book and I'm hoping someone else returns it. So we observe those kinds of norms with one another, and we take care of things. The Commons is also a system of shared management of all kinds of resources, and there's lots of research that has been done. In fact, the first Nobel Prize ever given to a woman, and the last so far, has been around the study of the commons as an effective form of stewardship of resources. But why are we talking about them tonight? Why are we talking about the commons tonight? I think from my vantage point, we live at a time of tremendous choices, and we need to look at, are we going to continue down the path we've been on, or are we going to avail ourselves of other ideas? The commons suggest that we could organize ourselves in ways that are of mutual accountability, of a sense of ours and shared resources. I'm getting the 2-minute warning, and I have many examples, so I'm hoping to share those with you later. But I think it also is a way of organizing ourselves around a sense of abundance, but one that is tempered by a sense also that we need to pass on to future generations something of sustenance and substance to them, and so that it's a sense of sufficiency and restrained use at the same time that we experience the abundance and well-being of that. So I think it's a paradigm that can offer us a hopeful and shared path, and not just a path of sort of individual survival, but collective well-being. Thanks.
And we will come back to you for this.
Yes, I'll give some more examples.
And the halfway mark, if you wouldn't mind. Since we have a good moderator who is keeping us on track, I'll keep my thank yous very short. Thank you for being here, and thank you for bringing me here, and Rabbi Bert and Nina, I appreciate the invitation. Maybe I should have gone first, because these two hopeful speakers were great, and now I'm going to bring the dose of reality. My work at World Watch has shown me how far we've been from sustainability ever since it came on the map, maybe by the modern environmental movement, maybe before, but we keep getting further away. And I want to start maybe just by pointing out how far we are from it. How many of you have heard of the ecological footprint? Okay, good. And you've probably heard that we're using 1.5 planets worth of planetary capacity or biocapacity to live as a species. So we're drawing on ecological capital faster than it can replenish itself. Americans alone, if everyone lived like us, would be using 5 planets. Or in other words, we could only sustain about 1.4 billion people. And there are 7 billion people now, and another 1 to 2 billion on the way by 2050 or so. So we've got a far way to go, which is hard to give some actual context to. In the new State of the World, the co-founder of the Ecological Footprint, Bill Rees, along with Jenny Moore, actually wrote a chapter called Getting to One Planet Living. And they used Vancouver as a case study to see just how far they'd need to go to get to a one-planet way of life. And I'll just read a quote. If the average Vancouverite followed a vegan diet, avoided driving or flying and only walked, cycled, or used public transit, lived in a passive solar house that used almost no fossil-based energy, and cut their personal consumption by half, they could only reduce their per capita ecological footprint by 44%, which is 60% above their fair share of biocapacity right now, ignoring any additional population increases. And again, assuming that we actually equitably distributed, so everyone using too little capacity, living in dire poverty, actually got a little bit more, and so on. So to really have a one planet lifestyle, we're talking about living on $5,000–6,000 a year per capita, in houses that are, on per capita 300 square feet, no fossil fuels, all that, which is far to go. In other words, we not only can't just achieve a steady state economy and say, hey, we're living sustainably, we have to degrow the American economy, the Canadian economy, even the European economies, shrink them. And now degrow is a fancy way of saying that this is not just a unplanned economic contraction, but more like the equivalent of not just starvation, but a diet, going on a planned diet. You don't just stop eating one day and decide that's how we're going to degrow. You start getting rid of the sweets and getting rid of the alcohol and other things that might not be actually healthy calories. And there's not really a choice between degrowing or contracting or keeping on the sustainable growth paradigm that we'd like to go, because that sounds nice. Sustainable growth, green growth, that sounds doable. But unfortunately, the planet demands that we degrow. And that means either choosing a path of kind of unplanned or planned contraction. And my work over the past few years is looking at what degrowth could entail and how that process could actually be not just less painful, but actually good, right? And actually something, there's a lot of human ill-being coming out of our growth economy. Obesity is a perfect example. 2/3 of America's population is overweight or obese, and that is causing more incidences of heart disease, cancers, diabetes, and so on. We're stressed. One of the largest prescribed drug is antidepressants, and that's coming from the breakdown in social communities, in part because we work too long, we spend a lot of hours commuting to other areas, we've lost our connection to neighbors, we have to build tool libraries to rediscover it. We can't just knock on our neighbors' doors anymore. So in very brief amount of time, because the setup is worth focusing on, just 3 simple ways that we could start moving towards degrowth, and I'm happy to talk more in depth about any of these, is one, we have to recognize that the culture that we're part of, the globalized consumer culture now, we're also involved in other cultures, of course, family, community, religious, but the American consumer culture has made it feel natural to live an unsustainable, high-consumption lifestyle. Even like entitlement, upon entitlement of we should be eating meat multiple times a day, flying off to exotic places for the weekend, having pets, and all these things, which pets are a major ecological impact too, even though they make up for the social isolation we feel. So anyway, but there's many ways to transform the culture, to be a cultural pioneer, to use whatever institution you're part of, a tradition, like Judaism or any other religion, whether your role as an educator or a teacher, even your role as a marketer. Marketing has helped to really drive us to be consumers, and it can be and it has been used to drive us towards living sustainably. The second whole point is, I think Alexa really talked about already, this rebuilding public goods, the commons, libraries, public water systems, public transit, so we could actually live car-free. And that's going to depend on increasing taxes, better distributing tax burdens, probably in this culture to shift those tax burdens to different areas. Carbon would be a good one. Advertising would be great to tax. Disposables, junk food. These are ways to actually shift our way of living and actually generate revenue so that we can rebuild our public libraries, so that the idea of buying every book other than State of the World, of course. You should just check this out at the library. Don't buy your own. That public goods are important, and actually putting money into rainy day funds as governments is essential because we've already built in a lot of ecological change into the system, and we're going to have to deal with that change, and it's going to be expensive. And then the third is, what do I have, 1 minute, 2 minutes? I had 7 minutes many minutes ago.
No.
Oh.
I was preparing that.
Oh, look at that. I talked way faster than I had to. All right, okay. I had the 7-minute mark at 11 minutes. Good. Well, the last point I'll make is what Juliet Shores calls cultivating a plenitude economy. We have to exit as much as possible, and in large ways, the formal economy. In good ways, that means working less. We work. The idea of a 40-hour work week is no longer relevant. If you actually, there's a great study from the UK that averaged all the hours of people work, adults work in the UK, those who are working too many hours, those unemployed, those underemployed. If you average out the average work week in the UK, it's 21 hours. So the perfect way to do it is try to curb the average work week to about 20 hours. And that can be by just having a 20-hour week. That could be reintegrating maternity and paternity care. Sweden has 480 days of maternity and paternity leave shared. You can divide it in any way you want, which I have a 10-month-old, and that would have been nice. Those kind of ways. Over the course of a lifetime, you get your less work over certain periods. You work fewer hours per week. And that doesn't mean you keep the same salary, just to be clear. This is not a French proposition here. The 35-hour work week get paid the same amount. You get less money means less disposable income. More people will have enough money to pay for the basics, the food, basic shelter, and so on, but the consumer luxuries will start to disappear from the system and reduce the ecological impacts. But you'll also have more time to reconnect socially, build a community tool library, to actually take care of your own children instead of outsourcing that to a daycare. As a new parent, I've met many parents who have had to actually become nannies for other people's parents and then give their own child to their grandparents or something. It's a sad, this whole design of our system where we outsource our elder care and our child care as we make a living. And so on. And then, of course, just have more leisure time and relaxing time with that more time that we have. So those are 3 ways to help facilitate the degrowth. And I think, again, it's very important that we pursue that intentionally because the alternative is very ugly. Right now, Bill McKibben did a recent article in Rolling Stone that talks about how we have about 500 gigatons or 2,500 gigatons of carbon sitting in our Earth's crust in some sort of natural gas or oil or coal. And if we burn all of that, we'll have runaway climate change, a true sci-fi dystopia. And even if we just burn a fifth of that, we're committing ourselves to a 2-degree future filled with a lot of nasty political and social disruptions and ecological disruptions. So we have to rapidly and ideally controlledly move toward a degrowth economy, a sustainable culture to replace the consumer culture. And that's going to take a lot of bold action. In the new report we talk about, we even included a chapter on the role of resistance in the environmental movement because I think we're using it too little. But also redeveloping our governance systems, teaching environmental education in a way that makes it clear that a disaster doesn't necessarily mean that we're all going to say, whoa, that New Orleans, I guess we should figure out a new way to live. Or I guess I should point to Hurricane Sandy since we're in New York. I guess we should figure out a new way to live. So really have to think actively about how we get to this positive future before a negative future is thrust upon us. So, thanks.
just before Nina engages our panelists who have already given us so much food for thought in their conversation, I want to remind you, you do have question cards, and you can begin filling them out. And when the first round of conversation is done, the ushers will bring them up to me, and I will sort through them so that Nina can then also bring the audience questions into the conversation. Rabbi Carter.
So I just want to start off this, and hopefully you guys will respond to each other. So, Laura, degrowth. Can you take degrowth to Exxon, to GM? Can you talk about degrowth in a capitalist system where, in fact, we worry about the return on our investments to pay for, my retirement fund? So how do we blend degrowth with corporate desires?
Well, that's really a wonderful question, and I'm so glad that the issue of obesity came up with no reflection on the wonderful meal we had before we came to the table. Because when you think about this idea that companies operating in just and sustainable ways are actually good business, so you start to tease that out a little bit. And I'll quote from one set of studies that we've been working on with beverage companies, consumer packaged good companies, quick service restaurants, okay? So what we all know is that advertising and marketing has led us all to think that we desire more fat, more sugar, more salt than is healthy. And we now have a genuine public health crisis. Talk about degrowth. We could use some degrowth in the United States. And frankly, it's one of our great exports to the rest of the, at least the developed world, you know? I happen to be married to a French person, the skinniest modern culture in the world. And I'm watching French people get a little heavier every year, which brings a certain amount of joy and a certain amount of sadness. So, first we know that marketing has created these desires that as human beings are probably not good for us. Second, we know that science has taught food scientists how to engineer things so that we're kind of addicted to these foods. And third, we all know this. And so what we have done with these various companies is started to do some market research around changing their product portfolios to what some folks call better for you foods. By starting to reverse some of this influence and marketing, by starting to reverse some of what we know is not good in product formulation and in placement and in all kinds of approaches to convincing us to eat things we don't need to eat, companies actually start to make more money. Now, do I think there's any universe where we really need soda companies and quick service restaurants and consumer packaged goods? Well, no, but frankly, the genie's out of the bottle. So if we can start to convince companies to use their same technology to reverse engineer this stuff, if we can start to convince these companies that it is an extreme risk to their reputation and therefore brand and therefore sales to be marketing bad stuff to kids in ways that kids have absolutely no way of counteracting, if we can start to talk to companies about this and convince them that it actually makes sense in the business case, we can start a degrowth process. Now, ExxonMobil, some of the energy companies, can we convince them that they don't want to be energy companies? I don't think so. But what we can convince them is that it's very bad for their brand to not start to develop alternatives instead of continuing to do what they're doing that, again, builds up the planetary insufficiency. So I think it's a question of changing the message and thinking about how do you use technology and what we know now to convince companies it's in their best interest. Is that degrowth? Well, in the case of obesity, maybe. But I think it is a way of working within the system to get the system to work with you, if that makes sense.
So I want to kick it back to Eric for a minute, and then I want Alexa to talk about it, because I think that both of you offer a challenge to endless corporate growth, right? And the question is, what are your responses to how do we work within this corporate capitalist system to help them move in your direction, or how do you see this all working together?
You know, it's a real hard question, because on the one hand, certain companies have to go under, right? We want Pepsi out of business, right? I mean, period. I mean, I don't want them selling bottled water as a solution, because it's huge amounts of plastic. It's drawing all the water from one community or maybe a few, you know, instead of feeding those crops in that locality, and marketing something and selling it at 1,000 times the value anyway. So let them die, but you know, in the politest way possible. Like Twinkies, for example. They almost went bankrupt recently, Hostess, and that was a good thing. Although the brand was valuable enough that someone bought it, and will probably reinvent it. But so there's the positive stuff. That my positive is maybe others' negative. But there's the activist activities that can happen. The brand smashing or the ad jamming. The Yes Men is a great example. They plummeted Dow's investment numbers, share price, by something like $3 billion total in a few hours by announcing that they were going to pay for the Bhopal disaster. Of course, the price went back up once they discovered it was a hoax. So that's the more radical stuff. But there's also entrepreneurial ways to create new business opportunities from degrowth. Not everything is going to degrow. You know, the smart investor will pull out of Exxon before there's a carbon tax, and they suddenly are much less valuable, and invest in, you know, maybe solar, maybe wind, maybe seed companies. Right? There's, you know, the future of America is its past. Well, a lot of us one day will once again be homesteaders. The suburban, the bedroom communities of today, where people commute into the cities, will be homesteading communities. That's just, you know, that's just pure physics. We can't keep going like this. So, you know, smart businesses will start realizing that there's one housing company that started designing a model that incorporates elder housing into the housing, an in-law apartment, and starts designing for the multi-generational home. And a lot of us will be living with our parents if they live long enough. You know, I mean, the consumerism has shortened lifespans for many. So there's those entrepreneurial opportunities. There's the incremental. I agree. We want Pepsi to start thinking of different ways to pull some of the sugar out, or at least we don't want Coke spending millions of dollars to block the Bloomberg ban on large sodas. How ridiculous. But you know, there needs to be ways to rein them in so that the process isn't derailed, the process to getting to a sustainable culture isn't derailed before it even begins.
Well, I noticed there were some farmers out front. Are they here? Yes. So I want to speak to that. I was really glad to see you guys here. Buckminster Fuller says that one of the, if we want to change a system, it's not to fight it as it exists, but to create an alternative. And that ultimately will make the system as it exists obsolete. And so you're here as, I'm guessing, small-scale farmers creating wonderful pickles and dilly beans, the growth of the local food movement, of the CSAs, of all kinds of farmers markets. I forget what the statistic is, something like a 2,000% increase in farmers markets in the last 15 years, something like really on that order. incredible explosion of attention to food. I went to a canning workshop thinking there wouldn't be many people there. I was the oldest person there, first of all. It was like all these young 20-year-olds, you're like canning. And I thought, wow, it was like my grandmother and now people in their 20s. So it's an exciting sort of rediscovery of self-sufficiency and food and attention to where food comes from. And it's a whole movement that has sort of sidestepped the food industry. And while there remains many fights with the food industry, there's also this sense of creating for ourselves a different future. And I think the Commons is very much about that, is reclaiming and re-understanding, reinventing, and in some cases of creating a new systems and ways of being in relationship to one another that create well-being, that create abundance, that aren't dependent on a growth-based economy. Again, like a tool bank, I don't need to own every tool. I don't need to have a snowblower. I don't need to maybe even necessarily have a car if I have the ability to share those things with other people. And I think it's obviously at a larger scale, I can't protect all those things alone. I need to do that with other people. And that will be very important in terms of our water. Just want to put a note on something that is maybe sort of on the scale that you're talking about, which we often think of commons at a very localized level, community gardens and some of the things I've talked about. One of the projects I work on most is around water, and one of the most alarming statistics as we grow as a population is the availability of sufficient water. But we tend to have a very disconnected relationship. I mean, you're sitting, somewhere in New York, you turn your water on, and here it is, and you drink it, and you really don't dump it if you don't finish it. Don't think about the fact that here this is being piped into us from the Catskills. We have some of the best water in the world. And because we don't have a very strong relationship to it, I wonder how many of you are aware of the threats to this water. Mm-hmm. So yeah, this crowd, yes. So there are threats, and we can talk about them, but certainly being aware of where it comes from, how we might protect it, and that it's even a sense of ours about it, that we have a stake in that is really important. So that's I guess, another vantage point on this whole discussion of growth is what are we growing? And what is our role in that? And the Commons, I think, offers us both a model, but also a sense that we can be the co-creators of that future.
Did you want to mention, while you've got the mic, some of the examples that you didn't get to mention before?
I'm just going to mention one example because there's so many. I mean, from tool banks up to citizen efforts to create in the case of the Great Lakes, a citizens' charter for the Great Lakes that establishes a sense of belonging and rightful role in the decision-making about that water, so that's sort of very different scales. I want to just share one example of just what commons thinking can bring. Nina, you mentioned orchards. Milwaukee, a city that I've lived in for until fairly recently, there was an inner city neighborhood that it was a food desert, had very little local food, that was very interested in growing more food, and they had polled their membership, which was largely African American, about what foods they missed. The leading missed food was peaches from many of their childhoods in the South. So they found a hardy variety of peach that could grow in Milwaukee, and they set out to try to find a plot of land to grow it on, and were thwarted. After a process of about a year, they could not find a plot of land that was sort of like had enough sun, that wasn't going to be developed, that they could buy. Came back to the community and said, sorry, we can't do an orchard. And there was an older gentleman in the crowd, and he said, I think we're missing the point here. We have the orchard. Everyone looked at him mystified, and he said, how many of you have a yard in this room? Mm. And it was like a bolt of lightning. Suddenly the abundance that was in their midst was apparent, that they actually had the land they needed all along, and they could grow it still as an orchard, in that they could plant it and learn to tend it and grow it and harvest it and create celebration around this peach orchard, which was dispersed. And so a model of the commons was sort of born on the spot that had not been perceived as possible. And so I think, there's some commons that are sort of blindingly obvious, and others take a little bit of a leap of imagination to see the obvious, and that we then have to actually do the work then of community that enables us to create and sustain those kinds of shared resources.
So, Bert, do you need a few more minutes to come up with questions, or are you good?
Oh, no, there are many questions.
We'll try to be shorter on our answers.
And make it a little easier on you.
There seems to be more cards than people in the audience.
Okay, so the first question, we'll see who this goes to first. What is the biggest environmental issue we are facing, And if you had the power for everyone to take one action on that issue, what would you choose? So what's the biggest environmental issue we are facing? And if you had a magic wand to encourage people to do one thing about that, what would it be? Who wants to start?
I feel like you've already started us down that path.
Just briefly, I mean, this whole growth in consumer culture, I mean, we have to change that. We have to shift the purpose of our lives and our societal institutions away from the idea that the more we consume, the more we grow, the better off everyone is, to the more sustainably we live, the better things are distributed. That becomes the purpose or the driving factor of society. And how do we do that? I talk about this in my work, that cultures can and are actively changed all the time, in small ways and big ways, and all of us have some sort of role to play in that, right? We all have an institution that we have influence over, and cultures that we have influence over, whether that's our family culture, whether that, if you're a teacher, your school culture, so integrating sustainability into the curriculum, or working with the cafeteria staff to integrate healthy and sustainable food, or building a garden or orchard program in the school, and so on. Whether you're in policy or government, whether you're in marketing and media, there's always a way to pull us away from this unsustainable path. So it's not about small actions like changing light bulbs and buying a hybrid, or even better, living car-free. Those are important, those are valuable, those help reinforce your own commitment to sustainability at the individual level, but more important is using the power you have to make much bigger changes, multiplier changes.
Let me ask you another question. One of you
Yeah.
can't answer that. We'll give you a break for a second. But this question, I think, is a question that all of us working in the environmental arena and sustainability arena ask ourselves all the time. It's something we talked about at dinner. And it's phrased this way: what are some ways you've seen effective strategies for explaining what is really happening without making people very scared and depressed and overwhelmed and essentially retreating, from the issue, and moving people from feeling helpless and overwhelmed to empowered and active and forward-thinking? How do you talk the talk to help people walk the walk?
I actually think there's a lot of joy and celebration to be had in doing something different. I think about how many of you have been to a farmer's market. It's a joyful experience. The library is packed. Community events like this, opportunities to talk and be part of things. Some of you may have participated in some of the participatory budgeting stuff that's happening in New York. There's lots of occasion for engagement and feeling like we are part of creating something new and different that can be really hopeful and actually joyful. And so I think rediscovering the meaning and value of community and of sharing things is actually really important. If we only have bad news to tell, we shouldn't be surprised if people don't want to hear it. It can be very discouraging. So I think part of it has to be about inventing and creating spaces where people can feel like they are on a path to doing something that is hopeful and life-giving, and is about a culture of stewardship and a culture of co-creation, a culture of honoring the gift of this natural beauty that we have inherited, and this cultural beauty, and celebrating that in ways that are also about aligning ourselves with sustainability. That's what I would offer.
And there's a cluster of questions about the role of government. The real possibility of role of government, given the quandary and sort of the paralysis of government, and both government in the United States, government on an international level, and will corporations really be able to be moved if legislative pressure isn't put on them? So, Lauren, let me turn this to you.
I think, particularly in the U.S., government has got everything kind of upside down. And when I say upside down, I mean we tend to reward behaviors that are not sustainable and frankly not very just. And we don't have the courage to tax the things that would convince people really, really quickly to cut it out. So, you know, in economics, there's this whole notion of externalities, positive and negative externalities. And I really believe that government could have a huge role. And actually, with this answer, I get to actually respond to all three questions, which is very sneaky. But so if you don't notice, I just want you to know that's what I'm doing here. So we live in a country where people say we're creating an environmental investment. And when you look at the environmental investment, what you discover is that it's an investment that is composed exclusively of private water companies. Now, if you believe, as I do, that there's a human right to water, and that in fact, the reason God made us, like, I don't know, 90-some% water, is because we need water to sustain life. Everything revolves around water. And yet we live in a world where people celebrate charging each other for water instead of taxing business enterprises that use water to make things that are unsustainable and not good for our health. That doesn't make any sense to me. So if you were to ask me what was, for example, which I know you didn't, what was the most important environmental issue of today, I would say it's really thinking about, do we actually believe that people have a human right to water? And if so, what are we going to do about it? Because if we think that way, then all of a sudden we start thinking about, does fracking make sense or not just because gas is cheap? I don't know. Maybe not. We start to think about, does it make sense for a soda company to build a huge plant in India, which is water scarcity times 10? Does that make sense? I don't know. But I think it all comes back to, what have governments, and governments are us, you know, that's the commons. What have we allowed government to incentivize, and what do we allow government to penalize? And in our own country, I will just offer, my biggest concern is the role of corporate cash in how government decisions are made and who influences whom to incentivize and penalize what actions. So until we get this idea of corporate cash and this idea of, is a corporation a person that has a human right to water? Just like an individual, like the kids in the South Bronx that, you know, you were visiting earlier today. You know, who has a right to what? And what does it mean when all of a sudden we say, you know, freedom of speech means corporations can buy off politicians to ensure that their incentives are in place, whether it's mortgages or private use of water. And when we are too lacking the courage to actually tax carbon in spite of what we know it's doing to us. So help me understand all of that. I think it's, you know, incentives, penalties, government could be in that place and could be a lot more courageous, and I'd love to see them try.
Can I add something to that? I thought it was really interesting what you said with the commons and government, and I want to introduce another word which is related, which is governance. And I feel like that's related to me to citizenship. And we have this incredibly oxygen-deprived idea of citizenship right now. It's sort of, you know, you go, you vote, and that's it. And I think reactivating a sense of citizenship as governance, that governance means how we take care of what matters to us. How do we tend our community? How do we tend those things that matter? And sort of expanding the sense as opposed to government as something that's, you know, kind of over there and we're over here. I think we have to sort of reconstitute kind of a continuum of things that we care for. And of course, there'll be elected people that, you know, that operate at a government level, but I think we have to expand a sense of citizenship so that we're active participants. I'm fascinated by this participatory budgeting experiment in New York and several other places because it begins to actually give people in community an ability to actually determine some things that your money is directly going to go for. And I think it's one of the strategies to re-engage people to say, yes, you should be part of the meaningful decisions of your community. You should be able to shape where your resources go. You are a co-creator. You are a steward. You are a tender. I believe that there's something tremendously transformative in that ultimately. If we start to believe that and don't relegate all the power, cede all the power to something somewhere else, then we start to down a path where we could change what happens. I think it's very difficult for me to see how we go from where we are to just changing it without that really active sense of citizenship.
Just, can you take 2 sentences and define participatory budgeting in case
Sure,
people don't
yes.
know?
Participatory budgeting, some of you may be familiar with it. It actually, I think it originates in other parts of the world, but it's come here, and the project here in Manhattan and Brooklyn, I think, maybe elsewhere, is there's several different council members who have designated a portion of their budget. So I think it's about $1 million a district, where community members can propose projects, and I think all of them are capital projects. So you can propose new capital development, so a park. I think in one case it was a large-scale compost, or another it was a bathroom facility for a park. There's all sorts of things, and people can come in and propose those. The community discusses them. There's research done. There's a budget created. They're sort of approved that they're feasible. And then the community votes and says, you know, we really think this is the one we want to have our money go to. And so $1 million is spent in each of those districts. Chicago is also doing it. I think San Francisco or somewhere out there is beginning to look at it. And there's another community elsewhere, someone else might remember. They do it other places in the world. There's a number of countries actually that do this. And it's both very empowering, but it's very exciting, because things that would never happen are getting attention. And so the hope is that it will expand, that more districts in New York will do it, that more money will go through that process, and it will enable us to actually tend to some things that sort of get out of the usual business as usual way things go, and actually link them more to community priorities.
So 7 minutes left, so I want to give you a chance to answer this question if you want to tackle it.
Yeah,
Yes?
just
Yep.
very briefly.
Wait, hang on a second. But
Okay,
I want to have you then think at the same time that you're answering the question. But the last thing that I want you guys to do, and that is to give us a charge, right? What do you want us to do when we leave this room? What do you want us to do tomorrow? Like, how do we start making change? Faith to action, right? So, okay, go first this and then that.
As far as governance, I think those are both great, and I think one other very subtle tool that is used all the time, often to make us consume more, but it's choice editing, right? It's when you walk into a supermarket and the milk is all the way in the back of the store, so you have chances to have multiple impulse buys by the time you get there, because that's the product you buy most often. But governments can do that as well, whether that's subtle taxes, which often work better than outright bans, as we just saw. But you know, in DC, a 5-cent plastic bag tax led to a huge drop in monthly bag consumption. So those subtle tools can really tweak the landscape of our choices. So that's on the choice editing. Can I not answer the other one quite yet? Since I was thinking about the other one, yeah.
Go ahead. We're all passing the buck here about the charge. I think what's important to say about it is there's no one thing. There's no one thing, and so it's important to think maybe what the thing is that you're going to do, but that each of us has to think about this very seriously. And I actually think the charge is to look, to put on the lens of the commons, and to look at the landscape of wherever you are, the neighborhood, the school, the community you're in, and ask yourself a set of questions. You know, what abundance is here that remains untapped? Who might I share it with that I don't currently? Where can I bring down some fences that would enable us to have greater well-being? And to choose something that occurs to you, something that needs tending or something that needs inventing, that could become a commons and a source of well-being and abundance for that community, that neighborhood, that place that matters to you. So that would be my charge.
Okay, I bought myself some time. If I were not at a seminary, I would say what I'd really like everyone in the audience to do is to remember that they're owners. You are owners. If you don't own stocks, That's all right. Because if you have a pension plan, if you've gone to a college, if you shop, you own a piece of this capitalist economy. And regardless of how you feel about capitalism, the reality is by asking questions, you can incite action. I cannot tell you how many faith communities that I visit who say, oh gosh, you know, nobody ever asks us, do we vote our shareholder proposals? Oh gosh, nobody ever asks us, do we engage ExxonMobil in the novel idea that they might want to use some of their huge research power to figure out alternative energies instead of fighting climate change? You know, nobody asks. And so if you are a pension holder, if you are a depositor in a bank, if you own mutual fund shares, if you worship at a congregation, ask questions about, so how do we know we're making good decisions about the capital that we are stewards of? And I think that if everyone thinks about being owners and asking questions, the right as an owner to ask questions and expect answers, that's powerful. But when I'm sitting in a faith community, it's more the idea, you know, this yours, mine, or ours. The reality is people of faith, particularly the Abrahamic religions, think that all of creation belongs to God anyway. We're just kind of borrowing it and being stewards. And so as stewards, it's even more important to ask questions, demand answers, because even if you don't get the answer you want, by asking the question, you have a chance that somebody somewhere is going to change what they're doing. And so that's what I would ask people to do.
And very briefly, I mean, these are two perfect examples of individuals using power that they have, much bigger than what they are just buying day to day or how they're living day to day, but you know, using their shareholder power, their owner power, their power as being part of a bigger community. And I would just say, think consciously, as I did before, about what other types of power you have, and use it to get us to a sustainable culture, whether you're an educator or a rabbi, or setting up a dinner and asking to make it more localized, as happened this evening. You know, there's really opportunities every day to shift the cultures of which you're part.
I want to thank you for really an enlightening evening. For those of you that come here regularly or see videos regularly, you're used to seeing bottled water on the table in front of each speaker. And the mere presence of this panel made us change what we do to something a little more sustainable.
And you'll do it next time as well.
God willing, yes, indeed. And we will. We learn, and we like to learn our lessons. We actually, Judy Greenberg gets credit for going into the cafeteria, sitting down with the people, and saying, how do we make a meal for our panelists, and how do we make a meal for our lunch and learn today with our students? How do we make it more local? And I have to say, our chef rose to the challenge. So little by little, we as an institution learn. Tonight's program also didn't just happen, and I've already commented that Nina and Josh were really my teachers in this and pushed me to do this. But one of the results is this is a co-hosted evening, the Interfaith Center for Corporate Responsibility, Laura, and Alexa's on the Commons, and Eric's World Watch Institute, and Nina's Baltimore Jewish Environmental Network, and there is another group called Hazon, which is a Jewish organization dedicated to environmental, and one of their offshoots is Adama, and they are here outside when you leave, and you have the opportunity to get their homegrown, kosher, organic, et cetera, et cetera. You can kind of fill in the blanks yourself. But word on the street is dilly beans, although they have pickles, kimchi. That's the way here at JTS. For those of you that don't know, David Kimchi was a medieval commentator on the Bible. So we assume that's what it is. we also are not only very fortunate to have this extraordinary panel and such good conversation, but the Jewish Theological Seminary is part of a greening initiative, and we have a greening fellow here for the year. Alia Vineker is the Assistant Dean of the List College of Jewish Studies, and she directs the Fellowship for Jewish Social Entrepreneurship. And she's going to give us 3 minutes of what you must do when you leave here tonight. So, Alia, thank you.
Thanks. So I don't have too much to add. I think the panel really gave us a comprehensive list of charges to go out with tonight. So if you're like me and you already make a lot of intentional choices around your own consumption and use of energy and resources, you probably have thought about what's more. So something I've been thinking about recently is really how to align my values with my actions in a way that's not just personal, not just in my 300 square foot apartment without pets, but really how to leverage the human capital that's in this community. So we've joined the Jewish Greening Fellowship. It's an 18-month fellowship that has really charged us with becoming a cultural pioneer. So really moving the Jewish community to lead around combating climate change. Some of our short-term projects already underway is replanting our rooftop garden. Our students did that today. Building a recycling center, crafting a Jewish greening pledge, and we have a number of long-term projects in the works as well, but all of them revolve around educating the community, reducing our own energy use and greenhouse gas emissions, making operations more sustainable, and really transforming the culture. So if you belong to any institution of your own, whether it's a congregation or a school or a more grassroots community, or you own a mutual fund, I think these are all things that you can do yourself. From a Jewish perspective, this is obviously part of our faith tradition. All of our holidays revolve around the environment and the systems in which we participate. And there are a lot of really fabulous Jewish environmental organizations that you can plug into as well. So Kojal, which is a fabulous Jewish environmental organization, has a covenant that you can sign online. Jewish leaders are pledging to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 14% by 2014. I'm not sure if that's going to happen, but it's worth pledging, so signing that covenant yourself. If you want to involve your communities around this educational piece, becoming cultural pioneers themselves, Green Faith does a number of environmental justice tours around all different kinds of communities that have faced environmental racism, so the South Bronx, Newark. And you can bring your congregations or schools on those as well. And then electoral activism, which the panel spoke about tonight as well. I think aside from just liking 350.org's recent Facebook status or signing a change.org pledge online, I think that identifying as Jews and identifying as community members actually goes much farther than agitating for change on our own. So Jews obviously are big voters. Our votes are being curried constantly by politicians, and if you self-identify as part of a larger community, it's going to get heard in a way that isn't just as Aaliyah Vineker from Brooklyn, New York. So I would really encourage you to think about that as well. So thank you.
Thank you.